It happened on a humid Tuesday morning outside a courthouse in Norfolk, Virginia. I had just stepped out of my black SUV, dressed in jeans and a gray hoodie, carrying a small duffel with service papers and personal notes. Nothing fancy. Just enough to get through the day. The security checkpoint outside was tense, local officers patrolling with their usual posturing, eyes scanning every figure for a reason to assert authority. I walked toward the entrance. Didn't say much. Didn't make eye contact. I've learned silence keeps you invisible. But not that day. Hey, you, bag down, hands up. I stopped, confused. 2 officers were already rushing up. Before I could even speak, one yanked my arm behind my back. Hard. What's this about? I asked, staying calm. You fit a description. Suspicious activity earlier. Stay quiet. My badge, the Department of Defense ID I carried, was still in my back pocket. They didn't check. They didn't ask. Within seconds, my wrists were locked behind me, cold steel biting into my skin. I looked up. Court attendees had paused. A few phones were out. Faces confused, some amused, others uncomfortable. But then a murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone had noticed something. From a black sedan that had pulled into the side lot, a man in full uniform stepped out. Polished shoes. Rows of medals. Presence that made people stop breathing. General Walter Dennison. 4-star commander of U.S. Marine Forces Command. And he was walking straight toward us. The moment General Dennison's boots hit the pavement, everything shifted. The murmurs stopped. The courtroom security officer near the entrance stood up straighter. Even the courthouse clerk by the door froze mid-step. The 2 officers didn't notice him at first, they were still gripping my arms like they'd just caught a fugitive. One of them was asking where I'd been this morning between 6 and 7. I didn't answer. I was watching the general. He moved with purpose, no rush, no hesitation. His expression was unreadable. That, more than anything, told me this was serious. Sergeant Major Gaines, he said, his voice sharp but calm. Both officers turned. Their faces dropped. The taller one stuttered, sir. General Dennison's eyes locked on the cuffs on my wrists. He didn't look at me, not yet. Just the cuffs. Then the officers. Unfasten those. Now. The tone wasn't angry. It was colder than that. Controlled. Precise. The kind of tone that made men in charge of battalions freeze. The shorter officer fumbled with the keys. "Yes, sir," he matched. That man," Dennison interrupted, voice rising slightly, "has spent more days deployed overseas than you've spent in uniform. That man has more confirmed enemy intercepts than you have parking tickets." The handcuffs clicked loose. I brought my arms forward slowly, rotating my wrists. The crowd was dead silent. Then Dennison finally looked me in the eye. "Sorry you had to deal with this, Sergeant Major. Let's go inside." I gave a slight nod, picked up my duffel, and followed him through the courthouse doors, past the officers who now wouldn't meet my eyes. As we stepped through the heavy courthouse doors, I felt every pair of eyes tracking us, from security guards to attorneys in tailored suits. No one said a word, but their faces said enough. I walked beside General Dennison down the marble hallway. He didn't speak again until we reached a side room, reserved for high-level meetings and federal liaisons. He closed the door gently behind us. "Take a seat, Gaines," he said, pulling out a chair across from me. I sat. He remained standing for a moment, adjusting the creases on his uniform, processing. Then finally, "I was briefed late last night. I asked you to meet me here because we needed a quiet exchange of documents. Not this circus." I nodded, keeping my jaw tight. I wasn't even through the front gate before they had me in cuffs. "You didn't flash your ID?" They didn't ask. They had a narrative in their heads before I opened my mouth. Dennison let out a slow breath and sat down, leaning forward. You're not the first. And unfortunately, not the last. But I'll be damned if I let it slide, especially not when it's one of mine. He reached into his case and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table. Your reactivation orders. Classified security detail. Comes straight from the Secretary of the Navy. I looked at him, eyes narrowing. You're pulling me back in. No. I'm inviting you back in, he said. You've earned that choice. But after what I saw today, I want your face in front of the people who make assumptions. He stood again. And I'll be making a statement outside this courthouse. Press is already catching wind. You can stand beside me, or not. Your call. I clenched the envelope lightly, my knuckles still stiff from the cuffs. I'll stand beside you. Dennison nodded once. Good. Let's show them what leadership looks like. We stepped back into the hallway, this time, side by side. The atmosphere outside the courthouse had changed. Word had spread fast. Local news vans were now parked just across the street. Reporters were setting up microphones on tripods. Bystanders lingered near the courthouse steps, pretending to scroll their phones, but watching closely. General Dennison paused just before the main doors and looked at me. You ready for this? I nodded once. Yes, sir. The doors opened. Flashbulbs popped. A low hum of voices rolled across the plaza. But it all went quiet again when General Dennison raised his hand. He stepped up to the podium that had been hastily rolled to the steps by a courthouse clerk. His voice carried with trained command. Good afternoon. I am General Walter Dennison, Commander of U.S. Marine Forces Command. I am here today to address an incident that never should have happened. He motioned for me to stand next to him. This man, he said, pointing to me, is Sergeant Major Roman Gaines. A decorated Marine. A sniper whose service has saved more American lives than most people will ever realize. Today, he was handcuffed outside this courthouse without cause. Without conversation. Without even identification being checked. The crowd stirred. Reporters leaned in. And let me be very clear, I will not allow those who serve this country to be treated as suspects by default. Not under my watch. Not in silence. A few claps started from somewhere off to the side, then grew into full applause. Someone yelled, Semper Fi, from the back. I didn't look over, I stayed steady, calm, my eyes locked on the horizon. Dennison continued, mistakes were made. We expect accountability. Not just because this man wore a uniform, but because every citizen deserves respect before judgment. He turned toward me. Sergeant Major Gaines will be rejoining us in a leadership capacity, one that ensures his voice will be heard on these matters moving forward. I gave a brief nod to the crowd. Then I turned to the two officers from earlier, now lingering off to the side, pale and stiff. I didn't need to say anything. They knew. Once the crowd began to disperse and the cameras started powering down, General Dennison placed a firm hand on my shoulder. You handled that with more discipline than most men would have, he said, his voice lower now, reserved for just us. Comes with the job, I replied, though the sting in my wrists reminded me not everything rolls off as easily as we pretend. The courthouse clerk came over timidly, offering us a private space to sit and review the paperwork. Dennison declined. We're done here, he said. The next steps happen on our ground. We made our way to the vehicle lot where his transport waited, a black government SUV with encrypted plates and a driver already standing at attention. Before getting in, Dennison looked at me once more. Roman, you know what this is now, don't you? I raised an eyebrow. What's that? This isn't just about a mistake. This is about who gets seen. Who gets respected. You being here today changed more than just your orders. He opened the rear passenger door but paused. "We don't need louder voices, we need stronger ones. Yours matters. Use it." I nodded. As the SUV pulled away, I looked out the window at the courthouse fading into the background. Same bricks, same badge, same officers. But things weren't the same anymore. Sometimes change walks in quietly. And sometimes it wears 4 stars and refuses to look away. A few days later, back at my home base in Quantico, a letter arrived. Not an email. Not a phone call. A hand-signed, sealed envelope delivered directly to my quarters. It was from General Dennison. Inside, a single sheet of thick stationery with the Department of the Navy seal stamped at the top. His handwriting was clean. Intentional. Sergeant Major Gaines, there are moments in every leader's life when they must decide whether to protect comfort or confront truth. You confronted it, without theatrics, without anger. Just strength. Your presence that day wasn't planned to make a statement, but it became one. We need men like you now more than ever, not just behind a rifle, but standing where others are afraid to. In boardrooms. In briefings. In front of those who forget what honor looks like. Enclosed is your updated clearance. Your new designation is Operational Liaison to the Joint Forces Ethics Review Board. Your role, to ensure what happened to you doesn't happen in silence to anyone else. Welcome back. WD. Beneath the letter was my new badge, silver-plated, with an embedded chip and a title I never expected to carry. I sat there for a long time, staring at it. For once, I wasn't silent. I whispered to myself, let's get to work. The next week moved fast. Briefings. Uniform updates. A roundtable meeting at the Pentagon. I found myself sitting across from officers I used to salute, now asking for my insight. But something shifted in the background I hadn't expected. Emails began to flood in. From Marines I hadn't heard from in years. From cadets I'd trained. Even civilians who had seen the footage online. One message stuck with me. It came from a young enlisted soldier out of Camp Pendleton. I watched the clip. I've kept my head down for years. Seeing you stand there. I realized I don't have to anymore. Another came from a courthouse employee. I was in the lobby that day. I didn't speak up, but I should've. I won't stay silent next time. It hit me harder than any award or medal ever had. The impact wasn't in the press conference. It wasn't in the promotion. It was in what happened after, when people started seeing themselves in that moment and realizing they had power, too. I wasn't just the guy who got cuffed. I was the reminder that sometimes being underestimated is the greatest setup for visibility. And now. I wasn't just back. I was seen. 2 months later, I returned to that same Norfolk courthouse, not in jeans, not carrying a duffel. This time I wore my full-service uniform, sharp creases, rows of ribbons, dress blues polished to perfection. But I wasn't there for court. I was the keynote speaker at a Justice Military Conduct Symposium. Funny how life works. The very officers who once put cuffs on me now stood in the back, silent and stiff. I didn't acknowledge them, not out of spite, but because the lesson wasn't about me anymore. It was about the system. About how quickly assumptions destroy dignity. On the stage, I adjusted the mic and looked out at the crowd, judges, attorneys, officers, veterans, cadets. Then I spoke. I didn't come here to talk about the handcuffs, I began. I came to talk about what happens after. I told them about the quiet power of posture. The importance of restraint. And how, sometimes, the highest act of leadership is simply not reacting how they expect you to. When I finished, the entire room rose in a standing ovation. Not for drama. Not for show. But for the principle. As I stepped down from the podium, a young ROTC cadet, barely 20, still green, approached me and said, "Sir. I want to carry myself like you. I looked at him, saw his nervous hands and eager eyes. You will, I said. Just remember, your silence can be louder than their judgment. And your presence, louder than their assumptions. We shook hands. That day, I didn't walk out of that courthouse a symbol of injustice. I walked out as proof that composure, earned through sacrifice, is more unshakable than any rank or robe. This time, they held the doors open. And I walked through on my terms. 2 weeks after the symposium, I was back at base reviewing internal cases when my phone rang, a direct line I hadn't heard buzz in years. Only a few people had the number. Gaines, I answered, standing instinctively. A familiar voice came through. Steady. Authoritative. Roman. It's General Dennison. Pack your bag. I didn't ask why. I just asked where. DC Situation Room. You're being moved up again. Full operational authority. We've got a visibility problem, and we need your name on the solution. I was silent for a moment. Sir, you sure? You've seen how they treat our own. You've lived it. We can't train that kind of insight. We can only trust it. Click. 3 hours later, I was airborne in a classified jet. No press. No salutes. Just purpose. The room I entered the next morning was nothing like the courthouse. This one was quiet. Vaulted. Full of decisions that shaped nations. And my seat, was already labeled. Gaines, Roman, Special Advisor to the Joint Committee on Civil-Military Oversight. Somewhere along the way, the cuffs had become keys. And I wasn't walking through their doors anymore. Now I held the ones they'd have to knock on. A year later, I stood at Arlington National Cemetery, not for a funeral, but for a ceremony. The Department of Defense had approved a new initiative, one I had quietly helped draft, the Gaines Protocol, mandatory de-escalation and identification procedures for all military personnel interactions on U.S. soil, regardless of uniform. It was the first of its kind. I didn't ask for it to be named after me. In fact, I resisted it. But General Dennison pushed it through, saying, it's not about the name. It's about what the name now represents. As the honor guard stood at attention, a young Marine, fresh-faced, boots barely scuffed, stepped up to present me a plaque. His hands trembled as he passed it over. Sir, he said, voice cracking, because of you. I walk into every room with my head up. I accepted it with a steady hand, but my throat tightened. Not from pride. From clarity. Because this moment, wasn't about the cuffs. Not about the courthouse. Not even about the 4 stars who had stepped in. It was about the ripple. About changing the course for the next generation of warriors, before the damage is done. I looked out at the rows of white headstones, then back at the young Marine. Make sure they remember, I said softly. But not what happened to me, what we did with it. He saluted. And as the sun dipped low behind the flags, I finally turned to leave. Not as the man who was wrongfully cuffed. But as the one who turned a mistake into a mission.